The Zagros Mountains, 9,000 years ago. Kael crouches behind weathered stone, watching something that shouldn't exist. Below in the valley, a creature moves like liquid lightning, 4 legs carrying it across the earth with impossible grace. His tribe calls him the dream walker, the shaman who sees visions others cannot. But this is no vision. The magnificent beast stops, turns, and stares directly at him with eyes that seem to hold ancient wisdom. Kael's hand trembles on his spear, not from fear but from recognition. In his dreams he's ridden this creature across endless plains, felt the thunder of hooves beneath him, seen his people spread across the world like wildfire. The tribal elders dismissed his visions as madness. They don't understand that some dreams aren't prophecies, they're memories of what must come to pass. As the creature takes a step toward him, Kael realizes this moment will either doom his people or launch them toward greatness. But what if the horse isn't just an animal? What if it's been waiting for him? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carries scents of morning frost and something else, something that makes Kael's spine tingle with electric awareness. The creature's coat gleams like polished obsidian in the dawn light, muscles rippling beneath skin that seems to shimmer with an otherworldly quality. Its mane flows like dark water, but there's something strange about the way it moves, as if each strand responds to invisible currents in the air itself. Kael forces himself to breathe slowly, the way old Naya taught him during his first vision quests. But his heart hammers against his ribs like a trapped bird. This creature, this horse, though he has no word for it yet, stands taller than any beast he's encountered, larger than the wild oxen his people hunt, more graceful than the deer they track through mountain passes. The animal's ears flick forward, alert but not alarmed. Its nostrils flare, tasting his scent on the mountain breeze. Kael realizes with growing wonder that the creature shows no signs of fleeing. Every instinct honed by generations of hunting tells him this should be impossible. Wild animals run from human scent, from the predator musk that clings to those who kill to survive. Yet this magnificent being seems almost curious. A memory surfaces from his most vivid dream. The sensation of powerful muscles moving beneath him, the world blurring past at impossible speed, wind whipping his hair as vast landscapes unfolded like a scroll of possibilities. In that vision, he had felt invincible, as if he and the creature had become something greater than the sum of their parts. The horse takes another step closer, and Kael notices something that makes his breath catch. The beast's eyes aren't just intelligent. They seem to hold depths that mirror his own dreams, as if this creature too has been searching, waiting, remembering something that hasn't happened yet. Slowly, Kael rises from behind the stone barrier. His movements are deliberate, unthreatening, guided by instincts he doesn't fully understand. The spear feels heavy in his grip, and after a moment's hesitation, he sets it aside. Something deep in his consciousness whispers that weapons have no place in this encounter. The horse watches his every movement, head tilted with what Kael can only interpret as approval. The morning sun breaks over the eastern peaks, flooding the valley with golden light that seems to dance around the creature like a living aura. For a heartbeat, Kael wonders if he's stepped into another vision, another dream that will dissolve when he tries to grasp its meaning. But the cold stone beneath his feet is real. The sharp mountain air filling his lungs is real, and the profound sense of destiny settling over him like a mantle weighs heavier than any dream. The horse steps forward again, closing the distance between them to mere arm's length. This close, Kael can see the incredible detail in its construction, the perfect curve of neck, the intelligent placement of eyes, the powerful chest that speaks of endurance beyond anything in his experience. But more than its physical perfection, he senses something else radiating from the creature: purpose, as if this being understands exactly why it's here. Kael extends his hand, palm open, fingers steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The horse's nostrils flare again, processing his scent with careful consideration. Then, slowly, deliberately, the creature steps forward and touches its muzzle to his palm. The contact sends electricity shooting up Kael's arm and through his entire body. Not pain, but recognition, a connection that feels like coming home after a journey he doesn't remember taking. In that instant, images flash through his mind, vast herds moving across endless grasslands, cities rising where now only wilderness exists, his people transforming from scattered tribes into something magnificent and unified. The horse's warm breath against his skin carries with it the promise of everything his dreams foretold, and in its ancient, knowing eyes, Kael sees the future beginning. The creature had not moved for 3 days. Kira crouched behind the fallen log, her spear trembling in her grip as she watched the strange being that had appeared at the edge of their territory. It stood taller than any wolf, its coat shimmering between silver and gold in the dancing firelight from their camp. Most unsettling were its eyes, deep pools that seemed to hold an intelligence that made her skin crawl with recognition. "It watches us like we watch the herds," whispered Jorik, the clan's eldest hunter, as he settled beside her. His weathered face bore the concern that had been growing among their people since the creature's arrival. But it shows no hunger, no fear. The rest of Clan Ashmark had gathered in a nervous cluster around their central fire. Children pressed close to their mothers while the hunters formed an outer ring. They had encountered many predators in their migrations across the vast grasslands, but nothing like this. Bears they could understand. Saber cats followed predictable patterns. This creature defied everything they knew about the natural order. Kira's younger brother Tam had been the first to spot it, returning breathless from gathering water at the stream. "Something follows," he had gasped, pointing toward the tree line. "Walks like wolf, but—" He had struggled for words that didn't exist in their limited vocabulary. Now, as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, Kira found herself moving closer, despite every instinct screaming warnings. There was something about the creature's posture, the way it held its magnificent head, that spoke of patience rather than threat. When she was close enough to see the individual hairs of its coat rippling in the evening breeze, it turned its gaze directly toward her. The contact sent a jolt through her consciousness, unlike anything she had ever experienced. For a moment, that stretched like honey from a comb, images flashed through her mind that were not her own. Vast landscapes seen from impossible heights. The sensation of running faster than any human could move, wind streaming through fur she did not possess. The complex social bonds of a pack that communicated through means beyond simple vocalizations. She stumbled backward, her spear clattering to the ground. The creature's ears pricked forward with what almost seemed like curiosity, but it made no move to approach. "Kira!" Jorik's voice seemed to come from very far away. She felt his strong hands grip her shoulders, steadying her as the world spun back into focus. "What happened? You went still as stone." How could she explain what she had experienced? Their language had no words for the concepts that had flooded her mind. She looked back at the creature and found it watching her with what she could only interpret as interest. That night, sleep eluded the entire clan. The creature had withdrawn to the edge of the clearing but remained visible in the moonlight, a silver shadow that seemed to pulse with its own inner luminance. Kira lay on her sleeping furs, staring up at the star-scattered sky, replaying the strange moment of contact. Elder Mira, the keeper of their stories and customs, spoke in low tones to the other adults. "In the old tales there were beings that bridged the world of spirits and flesh," she murmured. "Guardians that appeared when the people faced great change." "You speak of children's stories," Jorik replied, though his voice carried uncertainty. "This is flesh and blood. I can smell its scent on the wind." "Can you?" Mira's ancient eyes glittered in the firelight. "Then why do our dogs show no alarm? Why do they sleep peacefully while we keep vigil?" It was true. Their small pack of semi-domesticated dogs, usually quick to bark at any intrusion, remained curled by the fire as if the creature posed no threat at all. Some even seemed to be sleeping more deeply than usual, their breathing slow and rhythmic in a way that almost seemed synchronized. As the night deepened, Kira found herself walking toward the creature again, moving as if in a dream. This time, she left her weapons behind. Each step felt predetermined, as though she followed a path that had been laid out long before her birth. The creature rose as she approached, but not in a threatening manner. It stretched like a cat awakening from a nap, its movements fluid and graceful. When it looked at her again, the connection came more gently, like settling into warm water. This time, the images were different. She saw her own people as the creature saw them, small, struggling, but possessed of something precious and rare, a spark of potential that burned brighter in some than others. In herself, she realized with a start, that spark blazed like a beacon. Understanding began to dawn as their minds touched across the impossible gulf between species. This was no random encounter. The creature had been searching, following traces of something it recognized across vast distances and countless seasons. It had been looking for them. The beast did not flee when Kira approached the next morning. It stood motionless beside the dying embers of their fire, its luminescent markings pulsing with a rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat. The other hunters had scattered during the night, terror driving them back to the safety of the caves, but something deeper than curiosity held her here. She moved slowly, her spear lowered but ready. The creature's eyes, those impossible swirling galaxies of silver and blue, tracked her movement without hostility. As she drew closer, she noticed details that had been lost in the previous night's chaos. Its coat wasn't merely dark, it seemed to absorb light itself, creating shadows that defied the morning sun. The glowing patterns weren't random but formed intricate geometric designs that shifted and flowed like living circuit patterns beneath its skin. When she was close enough to touch it, the beast lowered its massive head. Kira's breath caught as those alien eyes met hers, and suddenly the world exploded into sensation. Images flooded her mind, not her own memories, but something far stranger. She saw the creature's perspective, vast migrations across landscapes that shifted between familiar and utterly alien, grasslands that phased in and out of existence, skies that held multiple moons, and herds of creatures that flickered like mirages between dimensions. The beast wasn't from their world, she realized with stunning clarity. It was from somewhere else entirely, somewhere the very fabric of reality was more fluid. The connection deepened, and with it came understanding. The creature, she instinctively knew it was female, had been searching, not for food or shelter, but for minds capable of forming the bridge. Kira's people, with their growing consciousness and expanding awareness, had reached a threshold. They were ready. But ready? The answer came not in words, but in pure knowledge that settled into Kira's mind like water soaking into dry earth. The creature's kind existed partially outside normal space and time, able to move through what Kira's mind could only grasp as folded distances. They had been watching humanity's development, waiting for the moment when early humans could serve as anchors, conscious beings capable of stabilizing their quantum existence in this reality. In return, they would share their gifts. Kira gasped as the mental connection intensified. She could feel the creature's consciousness merging with her own, creating something entirely new. Her perception expanded exponentially. She could sense the movement of every animal within miles, feel the underground water sources, detect the subtle electromagnetic patterns that danced through the atmosphere. The world had become a vast, interconnected web of energy and information, and she was suddenly able to perceive it all. More than that, she could influence it. With a thought, she encouraged nearby fruit trees to ripen faster. She sensed the confusion and fear of her fleeing companions and projected feelings of calm across the distance. When she focused on a pile of dry grass, it burst into flame without spark or friction. The power flowing through her was intoxicating and terrifying. The creature stepped closer, and Kira found herself placing her hand against its neck. The contact was electric, sending waves of shared consciousness cascading between them. She understood now why it had come. Alone, these beings were too unstable to maintain long-term presence in physical reality, but, bonded with humans, whose consciousness was just complex enough to provide quantum coherence, they could exist here permanently. The partnership would transform both species. Through the creature's memories, Kira saw glimpses of what was possible. Humans who could communicate across vast distances through thought alone. Settlements that could be established in impossibly hostile environments because the bonded pairs could manipulate local reality. Transportation that defied current limitations, moving through folded space rather than across linear distance. But the visions also carried warnings. Not all humans would be capable of forming stable bonds. Some minds would shatter under the quantum pressure. Others would become lost in the expanded consciousness, unable to maintain their individual identity. The process would be dangerous, requiring careful selection and preparation. As the mental connection gradually stabilized, settling into something more manageable, Kira realized she was no longer entirely human. The bonding had fundamentally altered her neurological structure, creating new pathways and capabilities that had never existed in her species before. She was the first of something new, a hybrid consciousness that bridged two entirely different forms of existence. The creature, she began thinking of her as Whisper, though the name came from concepts rather than sounds, shared her satisfaction. Together they would return to Kira's people and begin the careful process of selection and preparation. Not everyone would be chosen, and not everyone who was chosen would survive the bonding, but those who did would become the foundation of humanity's next evolutionary leap. Kira mounted Whisper's broad back, feeling the creature's muscles bunch with power that existed partially outside normal physics. As they moved toward the distant caves where her people sheltered, she marveled at the smoothness of their movement. They seemed to glide across the landscape as much as run through it. The age of mere survival was ending. The age of transformation had begun. The nights had grown longer since the creature's arrival, though Kira couldn't tell if time itself had shifted, or if her perception had simply expanded beyond its former boundaries. She found herself lying awake, staring at stars that seemed to pulse with newfound meaning, their ancient light carrying whispers she was only beginning to understand. The settlement had transformed in ways both subtle and profound. Children who once struggled to grasp the concept of tomorrow now spoke casually of events seasons away. Elders found their memories stretching back through generations they had never lived, accessing wisdom that felt both foreign and intimately familiar. The creature, whom the children had begun calling Ashanti, though none could explain why, moved among them like a living bridge between what they had been and what they were becoming. Kira watched from her sleeping place as Ashanti approached the dying embers of the central fire. The creature's form seemed to shimmer in the orange glow, not quite solid, as if it existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. When it turned its luminous eyes toward her, she felt the now familiar sensation of her consciousness expanding, like a flower blooming in fast forward. "Show me," she projected, though the thought felt clumsy compared to the elegant communication Ashanti employed. Without hesitation, the creature extended what might have been considered its hand, though the appendage shifted between forms as Kira observed it. The moment their flesh made contact, reality dissolved. She stood in a vast grassland under a sky painted in colors that had no names. But she was not alone in her body. Hundreds of other consciousnesses occupied the same space, their thoughts and experiences layering like sedimentary rock through her mind. She was Kira, but she was also Bren, the hunter who had first spotted Ashanti in the forest. She was Mira, the elder whose arthritic hands had crafted tools with impossible precision since the creature's arrival. She was even young Tam, whose drawings in the dirt now depicted complex mathematical concepts that would not be formally discovered for millennia. Through this collective awareness, Kira perceived the true scope of Ashanti's gift. The creature was not simply teaching them, it was awakening dormant pathways in their neural architecture, pathways that connected not just to each other, but to a vast network of consciousness that spanned the cosmos. Every sentient being that had ever existed, Every thought that had ever sparked across the synapses of an evolved mind became accessible through this quantum entanglement of awareness. She saw the future spreading before them like branches on an infinite tree. She watched their descendants develop technologies that seemed like magic, vessels that moved without touching the ground, structures that defied gravity, methods of communication that transcended the limitations of space and time. But more than that, she witnessed the evolution of consciousness itself, as humanity learned to exist simultaneously as individuals and as part of a greater collective intelligence. The vision shifted, and she found herself experiencing the creature's own memories. Ashanti had traveled between worlds, not in ships of metal and fire, but by folding space through the power of consciousness alone. Its species had long ago transcended the need for physical transportation as humans understood it. They moved through reality like thoughts moving through a mind, instant and effortless, guided by their deep connection to the quantum field that underlied all existence. But with this gift came responsibility. Kira felt the weight of countless civilizations that had received similar awakenings throughout the galaxy. Some had used their enhanced abilities to create paradise, societies where suffering was eliminated through perfect empathy and cooperation. Others had turned their expanded consciousness toward domination and control, creating hellscapes of mental tyranny that had required intervention from more evolved species. The choice lay before humanity like a crossroads made of light. They could follow the path of unity and transcendence, using their growing abilities to heal their world and eventually reach out to touch other points of consciousness among the stars. Or they could fragment into competing factions, each seeking to exploit their newfound powers for personal or tribal advantage. Through the connection, Kira felt Ashanti's hope, a motion that translated as warm golden threads weaving through her thoughts. The creature had been observing humanity for generations, waiting for the right moment when their species showed signs of readiness for this leap forward. Their capacity for both individual creativity and collective cooperation had marked them as promising candidates for consciousness evolution. The vision faded, and Kira found herself back by the fire, though she could feel that something fundamental had changed within her neural structure. When she looked at her sleeping tribe mates, she could perceive the faint threads of connection that now linked their minds. Soon they would all share variations of the experience she had just undergone. Soon they would face the same choice between transcendence and destruction. Ashanti settled beside her, its form stabilizing into something resembling the familiar shape of their first encounter. But now Kira could see through the illusion to the being's true nature, a crystalline matrix of conscious energy that existed primarily in dimensions beyond normal perception. Tomorrow would bring the real test of their species' readiness for the stars. The creature moved differently in the morning light. Where yesterday it had been cautious, almost timid, today it carried itself with a strange confidence that made Kira's skin prickle with unease. She watched from her position near the dying fire as it approached the stream, its movements fluid yet purposeful, as if it had been planning this routine for seasons. "It knows this place," Jorik whispered, settling beside her with his spear across his knees. "Look at how it moves, not exploring, remembering." The observation sent a chill through Kira's bones. The creature had never been here before, she was certain of that. Yet, as she watched, it navigated directly to the deepest part of the stream, the exact spot where the current would be gentlest, where drinking would be safest. It paused at intervals that perfectly matched the rhythm of a cautious animal checking for predators, but its head tilted at angles that suggested it was listening for something else entirely. Elder Thane emerged from his shelter, moving with the careful deliberation of age and wisdom, his eyes fixed on the creature immediately, and Kira saw something in his expression that hadn't been there before, recognition mixed with something that might have been fear. "Elder?" she ventured. "The old songs," Thane murmured, his voice barely audible above the morning wind. "There were always songs about the time before time, when the world was different, when minds could touch across distances like ripples in still water." He paused, studying the creature's graceful form. I thought they were just stories to help children sleep." The creature raised its head from the stream, water droplets catching the early light like scattered stars. For a moment its gaze swept across their camp, and when those ancient eyes met Kira's, she felt something shift inside her skull. A gentle pressure, warm and oddly comforting. Then the visions began. She saw the valley as it had been countless seasons ago, but not through her own eyes. The perspective was different, higher, broader, tinged with an understanding of wind patterns and weather that no human possessed. She watched herds of animals that had vanished from the world long before her grandmother's grandmother had drawn breath. She saw the slow dance of seasons across years, decades, centuries. But beneath the creature's memories lay something else, fragments of other minds, other perspectives, human minds. Kira glimpsed fleeting images, hands working stone with impossible precision, voices raised in complex harmonies that seemed to reshape the very air, groups of people moving with coordination that transcended anything she had witnessed among her own tribe. "Do you see it too?" Ren's voice seemed to come from very far away, though he stood only arm's length from her. She blinked, gasping as the present world rushed back into focus. Around the camp, every member of their hunting party stood transfixed, their eyes reflecting the same wonder and confusion she felt. They had all shared the vision. The creature stepped delicately from the stream and approached their group. Each footstep seemed to strengthen the connection, and now Kira could sense not just its memories, but its intentions. It wanted to show them something important. Without conscious thought, she found herself rising and moving toward it. The others followed, drawn by the same inexplicable compulsion. The creature turned and began walking up the valley slope, pausing frequently to ensure they kept pace. As they climbed, the connection deepened. Kira began to perceive the landscape through the creature's senses, the subtle chemical signatures that revealed which plants were edible, the underground water sources that couldn't be detected from the surface, the hidden paths that would allow swift travel even in the deepest snow. But more than practical knowledge flowed between them. She felt the creature's profound loneliness, an isolation that spanned generations. It was the last of its kind, or nearly so, carrying memories and wisdom that would die with it unless it found minds capable of preserving them. They reached a rocky outcropping halfway up the valley wall, and the creature stopped before what appeared to be solid stone. But as Kira watched, still caught in the web of shared consciousness, she began to discern patterns in the rock face, subtle variations in color and texture that formed symbols or perhaps a form of writing. The creature pressed its head against the stone, and suddenly the symbols blazed with inner light. The rock face shimmered like water and revealed an opening beyond, filled with a soft, welcoming glow. "Impossible," breathed Elder Thane, but he stepped forward nonetheless. Through their connection with the creature, they understood that this place was old beyond measure, built by the partnership between its people and early humans who had learned to join their minds across the species barrier. Here lay the tools and knowledge that had elevated those ancient humans beyond anything the current tribes had achieved. The creature turned to face them, and in its eyes Kira saw an offer, not of dominance or servitude, but of partnership, of a joining that would transform both species into something greater than either could become alone. She stepped forward into the light. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Kira approached the creature with trembling hands. 3 days had passed since the failed hunt. 3 days of watching her people grow weaker while the beast remained by the cave entrance, neither threatening nor departing. Her fingers wrapped around the wooden bowl containing their last portion of dried berries and roots. "What are you doing?" Jorik's voice carried a mixture of concern and disapproval. The elder hunter had opposed any interaction with the creature from the beginning. "Feeding it," Kira replied simply, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The creature's massive head turned toward her, those impossible silver eyes reflecting depths that seemed to stretch beyond the physical world. As she drew closer, the familiar sensation began again, a gentle pressure at the edges of her consciousness, like warm water lapping at the shores of her mind. She set the bowl down just beyond arm's reach and stepped back. The creature's gaze shifted from her face to the offering, then back again. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. Images flooded Kira's mind, not her own memories, but visions from another perspective entirely. She saw herself through the creature's eyes, but layered within that vision were emotions and concepts that had no names in her language. Gratitude, yes, but something deeper, recognition, hope, and underneath it all, a profound loneliness that made her chest ache with empathy. The creature lowered its great head to the bowl, but instead of consuming the meager offering, it gently pushed the food back toward her with its muzzle. The message was unmistakable. You need this more than I do. It understands, Kira whispered, tears blurring her vision. It knows we're hungry. Jorik stepped forward, his spear still ready but no longer raised in direct threat. How can you be certain? Before Kira could answer, the creature turned and bounded toward the forest with fluid grace that seemed to defy its size. The hunting party watched in stunned silence as it disappeared between the trees. Now it leaves, Brack muttered. We should have driven it away days ago. But Kira felt something different in the air, anticipation that made her skin tingle. No, she said quietly, it's coming back. The others looked at her with varying degrees of skepticism and concern. How could she know? She couldn't explain the certainty that had settled in her bones, the way the creature's intentions seemed to resonate in her mind like echoes in a deep cave. An hour passed before the sound of breaking branches announced its return. The creature emerged from the undergrowth, carrying something large in its mouth, a fully grown elk, its neck cleanly broken. The hunting party gasped collectively as the beast dropped the carcass at Kira's feet, then stepped back with what could only be described as pride. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Not only had the creature understood their need, it had chosen to provide for them. This wasn't mere animal intelligence. This was compassion, planning, cooperation. How did it know? Mira asked, her voice barely audible. Kira knelt beside the elk, her hands shaking as she touched the still warm hide. I think... She paused, struggling to articulate the incredible possibility forming in her mind. I think it can share thoughts, not just understand ours, but show us its own. As if responding to her words, the creature settled onto its haunches and fixed her with that penetrating silver gaze. This time, when the presence touched her mind, Kira didn't resist. She opened herself to the contact, letting the boundaries between her consciousness and the creature's blur. What she experienced defied everything she thought she knew about the nature of thought itself. The creature's mind was vast, ancient, filled with knowledge that stretched back through generations. She glimpsed landscapes that no longer existed, herds of creatures long extinct, and most remarkably, other humans, countless tribes across vast distances, all connected through bonds similar to what she was experiencing now. But the visions went deeper still. She saw possibilities rather than memories, futures that could unfold if the connection between human and creature grew stronger. She watched her own people spreading across continents, no longer bound by the limitations of foot travel. She witnessed the development of new forms of communication, technologies that emerged from the merger of human creativity and the creature's inherent abilities. Most astounding of all, she perceived the fundamental truth that would reshape everything. These creatures weren't just intelligent animals. They were partners, waiting for the right moment in human development to reveal themselves. They had been watching, protecting, guiding from the shadows until humanity reached the threshold of readiness. When the vision faded, Kira found herself on her knees in the dirt, tears streaming down her face. The hunting party surrounded her with worried expressions, but she barely noticed. Her entire understanding of the world had shifted in the space of heartbeats. The creature made a soft, rumbling sound, almost like a purr, and gently touched her shoulder with its muzzle. In that simple gesture, Kira felt the beginning of a bond that would echo through all of human history. "We need to bring it home," she said, her voice filled with quiet wonder. "This changes everything." The settlement had grown beyond Kira's wildest imaginings in the span of 3 seasons. What began as temporary shelters now stood as permanent structures, their walls reinforced with a strange crystalline substance that Zephyr had somehow guided them to extract from deep cave systems. The material seemed to respond to thought itself, hardening when they needed protection and becoming translucent when they desired light. But it was the children who showed the most remarkable changes. Kira watched as her own daughter, barely old enough to walk steadily, placed her tiny hand against Zephyr's flank and closed her eyes in deep concentration. The air around them shimmered, and suddenly the child was elsewhere, not physically, but her consciousness had somehow projected to the hilltop overlooking their valley. Through their bond with Zephyr, the adults could sense her wonder as she observed a herd of mammoths moving through the distant grasslands. "She's seeing through the wind currents themselves," Elder Thane whispered, his weathered face filled with awe and concern. "The children born since our bonding with the Wanderer, they're not quite like us anymore." Kira felt the truth of his words settle heavily in her chest. These new children could touch the quantum field that Zephyr inhabited as easily as breathing. They communicated in ways that transcended spoken language, sharing complex concepts through pure thought transmission. Yesterday, she had witnessed 5-year-old Jorik somehow convince a flock of birds to rearrange themselves into geometric patterns that seemed to pulse with meaning. "Perhaps this is what we were always meant to become," she replied, though uncertainty colored her voice. The responsibility of guiding humanity's transformation weighed on her daily. Sometimes she wondered if they were evolving or losing something essentially human in the process. Zephyr's presence touched her mind, bringing with it images of vast cosmic cycles, civilizations rising, changing, adapting to new realities. She saw flashes of other worlds where different species had undergone similar transformations, not losing their core nature, but expanding it beyond previous limitations. The creature's ancient consciousness carried memories of countless such partnerships across the galaxy. A commotion near the settlement's edge drew her attention back to immediate concerns. The hunting party had returned, but something was wrong. Instead of the usual triumphant calls, she heard urgent voices and saw people running toward the southern perimeter. Kira sprinted across the settlement, Zephyr flowing beside her like liquid starlight. What she found at the gathering circle made her blood run cold. 3 members of the distant mountain clan stood bound and guarded, their faces painted with symbols she didn't recognize. But it was what Jorik held in his small hands that truly alarmed her. "They brought these," the boy said, extending crystalline shards that pulsed with an sickly artificial light. They hurt to look at. The lead hunter, Gareth, stepped forward with grim expression. They came bearing gifts, claiming to represent a great alliance of clans to the north. But when young Jorik approached to welcome them, he collapsed. These crystals, they seemed to disrupt the bond. Kira examined the shards without touching them, feeling how they created interference in the quantum fields surrounding them. Through Zephyr, she sensed the crystal's purpose. They were crude but effective dampeners, designed to sever the connection between human consciousness and the expanded awareness the Wanderer provided. "Who sent you?" she asked the bound strangers. The eldest among them, a scarred woman with calculating eyes, smiled coldly. "The true path Brotherhood knows of your corruption, child of the poisoned bond. We offer salvation from the alien influence that twists your young into monsters." "Monsters?" Kira's voice carried dangerous quiet. "Your children speak without words, bend reality to their will, commune with forces beyond natural order. This is not evolution, it's contamination. The Brotherhood has found ways to purify the infected and prevent further spread." Through her bond with Zephyr, Kira suddenly understood the larger picture. Images flowed through the connection, distant settlements where fear had overcome wonder, where those who couldn't form the bond with wanderers had banded together in rejection of the transformation. They had developed these disruption crystals and were moving systematically to cleanse any humans who had bonded with the quantum entities. "You don't understand what you're fighting," Kira said, genuine sadness mixing with anger. "This isn't contamination, it's growth. It's becoming more than we were. We are human," the woman spat. "We will remain human, pure and unchanged, as we were meant to be." But even as she spoke, Kira could see the fear beneath her defiance. Fear of being left behind, of watching their species transform beyond recognition, of losing relevance in a rapidly changing world. The choice before her was clear but terrible. They could try to reason with the Brotherhood, potentially exposing their settlement to attack. Or they could prepare for conflict, using their enhanced abilities to defend their new way of life. As if sensing her thoughts, Zephyr's presence intensified around her, bringing with it the collective consciousness of the bonded children. In that moment, Kira realized the decision was no longer hers alone to make. The dawn brought troubling news from the outer settlements. Kira's scouts returned with reports of entire camps abandoned overnight, their inhabitants vanishing without trace of struggle or flight. The mysterious disappearances had accelerated, forming a ring of emptiness that seemed to be contracting toward their own territory. Arun stood at the edge of their expanded settlement, watching the horizon where smoke no longer rose from distant fires. The bond with his creature, whom he now called Tempest for the storm-like patterns that danced across its crystalline hide, had deepened over the past days. Through their connection, he could sense something vast and patient moving at the edges of perception, like a predator circling just beyond the firelight. "They're not random," Maya announced, spreading her carved mapstones across the ground. Her creature, smaller and more delicate than the others, seemed to shimmer with an inner light that helped her perceive patterns invisible to normal sight. The disappearances follow ley lines, paths of some kind of energy that run beneath the earth. Elder Thane approached, his weathered face grave. "The old stories speak of such things, paths of power that the first people learned to avoid. Perhaps we've grown too bold, strayed too far from the ancient warnings." But Arun felt something different through his bond with Tempest. Not warning, but urgency. The creature's consciousness pressed against his mind, sharing images of underground chambers and crystalline formations that pulsed with the same energy patterns he'd seen in their shared visions. Whatever was taking the people wasn't malevolent, it was desperate. "We need to go underground," he said suddenly. "There are spaces beneath us, connected to where the others have gone. Tempest can show us the way." Kira's hand moved instinctively to her spear. "Into the very places people are vanishing? That seems unwise." "Not vanishing," Arun corrected, the certainty flowing through his bond. "Gathering. Something is calling them, and we need to understand what." The debate that followed revealed the growing divide in their community. Some wanted to flee farther from the disappearance zone, while others argued for fortification and defense. But the creatures themselves seemed restless, their crystalline forms shifting colors in patterns that suggested anticipation rather than fear. By midday, a compromise emerged. A small expedition would venture underground, while the majority of the tribe prepared for possible evacuation. Arun would lead, accompanied by Maya and 3 of the most experienced scouts. Their creatures would guide them through the subterranean paths. The entrance revealed itself when Tempest pressed against what appeared to be solid rock. The stone dissolved like morning mist, revealing a tunnel that descended at a gentle angle into bioluminescent depths. The walls themselves seemed alive, pulsing with veins of light that resonated with the creature's crystalline skin. As they descended, Arun felt his consciousness expanding beyond the normal boundaries of self. Through Tempest, he sensed the vast network of tunnels that honeycombed the region, all leading toward a central chamber that thrummed with ancient purpose. But more than that, he began to perceive the presence of other minds, human minds, altered and enhanced, existing in a state of collective awareness that both thrilled and terrified him. "Do you feel that?" Maya whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the phosphorescent tunnel. Her creature had begun to glow brighter, adding its light to the wall's gentle radiance. Arun nodded. Through their shared bond, all of them were beginning to experience what the missing people had discovered. It wasn't abduction, it was evolution. The underground chambers were some kind of chrysalis, a place where human consciousness could be transformed and expanded through deeper integration with the crystalline entities. The tunnel opened into a vast cavern filled with geometric formations that defied natural explanation. Crystalline spires rose from the floor like frozen music, each one containing a human figure in a state that resembled deep meditation rather than imprisonment. Their faces showed peace, even ecstasy, and around each person, their creature companion had formed a cocoon of living crystal that pulsed with shared thoughts and dreams. At the center of the chamber stood a formation larger than the rest, ancient beyond measure. As they approached, Arun realized it was some kind of archive or library, containing the accumulated knowledge and experience of countless generations. The creatures weren't just companions, they were custodians of memory, keepers of wisdom that stretched back to the dawn of consciousness itself. But the revelation came with a choice. To access this knowledge, to join the collective consciousness that was forming in the depths, meant leaving behind individual existence as they had known it. The missing people hadn't been taken. They had chosen transformation, becoming part of something larger than themselves. Through tempest, Arun felt the weight of decision settling upon him. This was the choice that would define not just his own fate, but the future of human consciousness itself. Behind them lay the familiar world of individual struggle and limited perception. Ahead waited transcendence, purchased with the surrender of everything they believed themselves to be. The crystalline archive pulsed brighter, offering its ancient secrets, while above them their people waited for answers that might change the very meaning of humanity. The morning mist clung to the valley floor as Kira approached the creature's resting place. 3 weeks had passed since the first successful mind link, and each day brought new revelations that challenged everything her people thought they knew about consciousness itself. The beast, she had begun calling it Ashka, meaning bridge in the old tongue, lifted its massive head at her approach. The familiar tingle at the base of her skull told her it was already reaching out, tentative mental tendrils seeking contact. But today felt different. Where before the connection had been like stepping into a shallow stream, now it felt like standing at the edge of an ocean. Kira placed her palm against Ashka's warm flank and let her mind open. The world exploded into sensation. Not just Ashka's awareness flooded through her, but something far more profound. She could sense the intricate web of life that stretched across the entire valley. Every bird in flight, every root system threading through soil, every microscopic organism playing its part in the vast symphony of existence. Through Ashka's enhanced perception, she glimpsed the fundamental interconnectedness that bound all living things. "The network," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. This wasn't just communication between human and beast, it was access to something approaching omniscience. Behind her, she heard Jorik's sharp intake of breath. He had been monitoring their sessions, documenting the changes he observed in both Kira and the creature. Today, his measurements were off the scales. "Kira," he called, his voice tight with concern. "Your neural activity, it's unlike anything I've recorded." But Kira barely heard him. Through the link, she was experiencing Ashka's memories, and what she saw rewrote her understanding of their world's history. The creature's kind hadn't evolved on this planet. They had arrived eons ago, refugees from a dying world, carrying within their genetic code the accumulated wisdom of their civilization. They had waited, hidden in remote places, for the emergence of a species capable of true partnership. Not domestication, but symbiosis. The enhancement wasn't one-sided. While humans gained access to expanded consciousness, the creatures regained purpose, becoming the living libraries they had always been meant to be. "We're not the first," Kira said aloud, her voice carrying Ashka's harmonic undertones. "There were others, the stone builders, the sky watchers, the deep dwellers. all partnered with Ashka's kind, all transformed by the connection. Jorik stepped closer, his instruments forgotten. What happened to them? The answer came not in words, but in a flood of images and emotions. Civilizations that had risen to incredible heights, mastering technologies that seemed like magic. But with great power had come great choices, and not all had chosen wisely. Some had become so merged with their partners that they lost their essential humanity. Others had tried to dominate the creatures, breaking the delicate balance and losing everything. A few had found the middle path, evolving beyond the need for physical existence, becoming something new that dwelt between matter and energy. Their legacy lived on in the quantum field that connected all conscious minds, the very network Kira was now accessing. Balance, she murmured. It's all about balance. Through Ashka, she sensed others of its kind stirring across the continent. The successful bonding was sending ripples through their collective consciousness, a signal that humanity might be ready for the next phase of evolution. But readiness and wisdom were not the same thing. Kira felt Ashka's growing excitement and gently modulated it with her own caution. Too much, too fast, and they could follow the path of those who had lost themselves in the infinite. Too little, and they would stagnate, missing the opportunity for transcendence that might not come again for millennia. The connection began to stabilize as she found her center, learning to surf the vast waves of consciousness without being overwhelmed. She was still Kira, still human, but now she was also something more, a bridge between worlds, a translator between species, a guardian of possibilities yet to unfold. When she finally opened her physical eyes, she found Jorik staring at her in wonder and fear. The changes in her were becoming visible now. Her eyes held flecks of Ashka's golden color, and her movements carried an uncanny grace that spoke of perfect body awareness. "How do we control this?" he asked. "How do we ensure it doesn't consume us?" Kira smiled, and for a moment Jorik could swear he saw starlight in her expression. "We don't control it, we dance with it. We remain ourselves while becoming more than ourselves. The creatures have been waiting so long for partners who could walk that line." Around them the air itself seemed to hum with potential. Change was coming, whether they were ready or not. The only question now was whether humanity could learn the delicate art of transformation without losing its soul in the process. As Kira maintained her connection with Ashka, she knew their next choice would echo through the ages, shaping not just their tribe's future, but the destiny of consciousness itself on this world. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Kael stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the creatures below with new understanding. 3 days had passed since her mind touch with the stallion, and the world seemed fundamentally different now. Colors appeared more vivid, sounds carried deeper meaning, and she could sense the emotional currents of every living thing within 100 paces. "The change is spreading," Neru observed, approaching with careful steps. His own eyes held the telltale shimmer that marked those who had experienced the touch. 7 more hunters achieved connection yesterday. Kael nodded, though her attention remained fixed on the herd. She could feel their individual personalities now. The playful curiosity of the young, the protective vigilance of the mares, the complex intelligence of the stallion who had first opened her mind. Each creature possessed a depth of thought and emotion that her people had never imagined possible in any being other than themselves. "Elder Thane grows concerned," Neru continued. "He says we're becoming something other than human." "Perhaps we are," Kael replied softly. "Perhaps that's what we're meant to become." Below them, young Jorik moved among the creatures with fluid grace, his hand resting on the neck of a mare as they walked together. The boy had taken to the connection more naturally than any of them, as if his young mind was more flexible, more ready to expand beyond its original boundaries. Through him, they had learned that the creatures, who called themselves something that translated roughly to windrunners, had been waiting for their kind for longer than human memory could reach. A disturbance in the emotional field around them drew Kael's attention. She turned to see a group of hunters approaching, led by Dakur, one of Elder Thane's most trusted warriors. Their minds felt closed, guarded, radiating suspicion and fear. "Kael of the first hunt," Dakur called out, using her formal title. "You are summoned before the Council of Elders." She had expected this confrontation, though she had hoped for more time. The traditional leaders of their people viewed the changes with growing alarm, and she understood their fear. For generations uncounted, their society had remained constant, predictable. Now, in the span of days, everything they believed about the nature of intelligence and consciousness was being challenged. "I will come," she said, then looked back at Nehru. "Continue the work here. Help those who are ready to make the connection, but force no one. Understanding must come freely, or it doesn't come at all." The walk back to the settlement felt different now. Where once she had seen only familiar terrain, Kael now perceived layers of life and energy flowing through everything. The trees whispered of seasons beyond counting. The rocks held memories of ancient upheavals, and the very air seemed alive with invisible currents of information. The council circle had been expanded to accommodate the entire tribe. As Kael entered, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, along with the complex mixture of emotions radiating from the crowd: curiosity, fear, hope, anger, all swirling together in a chaotic storm of feeling. Elder Thane stood at the center, his weathered face grave. "Kael, daughter of Merin, you stand accused of leading our people into danger through communion with creatures whose nature and intentions remain unknown. How do you answer?" She had prepared for this moment during the long walk back, but now, standing before her people, Kael realized that words alone would be insufficient. Instead, she opened her mind, allowing her enhanced consciousness to extend outward, touching those who were ready to receive it. The effect was immediate and profound. A wave of understanding rippled through the crowd as they suddenly experienced, however briefly, what she had discovered. They felt the gentle intelligence of the wind runners, sensed the vast network of consciousness that connected all living things, and glimpsed the potential that lay dormant within their own minds. Many gasped and stepped back, overwhelmed by the sudden expansion of awareness. Others pressed forward, hungry for more. A few, including Elder Thane, stood frozen, their faces pale with shock and wonder. "This is what awaits us," Kael said, her voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "Not danger, but growth. Not loss of our humanity, but the discovery of what humanity can become. The Windrunners have not come to change us. They have come to help us change ourselves." Elder Thane staggered slightly, one hand pressed to his forehead. When he looked up at her again, his eyes held the familiar shimmer of expanded consciousness. "The visions," he whispered. "I have seen this in dreams for months, but thought them mere fantasy. Cities that float among the clouds, our people riding the wind itself, knowledge flowing between minds like water between vessels." "Not visions," Kael confirmed, "memories of what was and glimpses of what could be again." "We are not the first to walk this path, Elder. We are simply the first to walk it here, in this time." The crowd murmured with new understanding, and Kael felt the tide of fear beginning to turn toward cautious hope. The morning mist clung to the valley floor like the breath of sleeping spirits, but Kira felt no peace in its ethereal beauty. 3 days had passed since the unsuccessful hunting expedition, and the tribe's stores grew dangerously low. The bonded horses stood restlessly in their enclosure, their enhanced intelligence making them acutely aware of the community's mounting desperation. She approached Thunder's Dawn, the magnificent stallion whose consciousness had merged most completely with the crystalline network. His dark eyes held depths that seemed to reflect not just her own thoughts, but something far more profound, a collective wisdom that transcended individual understanding. "Show me," she whispered, pressing her palm against the pulsing crystal embedded in his forehead. The familiar rush of shared consciousness enveloped her, but this time something was different. Instead of the usual flow between her mind and his, she felt herself being drawn into a vast web of interconnected awareness. The other bonded horses, their human partners, even the unbonded members of the tribe, all of them flickered at the edges of her perception like distant stars in an endless constellation. Through Thunder's Dawn's enhanced senses, she could perceive the valley with impossible clarity, The electromagnetic signatures of every living creature painted themselves across her consciousness in brilliant colors. But more importantly, she could sense the patterns, migration routes of game animals, weather systems brewing beyond the mountains, and the subtle vibrations that spoke of danger approaching from the eastern passes. A group of riders was moving through the high country, their intentions dark and predatory. They bore the scarred markings of the Bone Clan, raiders who had been driven from their traditional territory by drought and famine. Their horses were gaunt, their weapons crude but effective. They were perhaps 2 days away, following the ancient paths that would lead them directly to the valley. Kira pulled back from the connection, gasping as her individual consciousness reasserted itself. But the knowledge remained, burning bright in her mind like a coal pulled from the fire. She had to warn the others, had to prepare the tribe for what was coming. She found Jorak near the sacred grove, his weathered hands working to repair a broken spear shaft. The old shaman looked up as she approached, and she saw her own urgency reflected in his eyes. "You felt it too," she said. He nodded grimly. "The network grows stronger each day. What was once limited to the bonded pairs now touches us all. The horses are teaching us to think as they do, as a herd, as a collective mind. Then you know about the raiders?" "I know about many things that trouble the winds." Jorak set down his tools and fixed her with a steady gaze. "But knowing and acting are different beasts entirely. The question is not whether danger comes, but how we choose to face it." That evening, the tribe gathered around the central fire pit, as they had for countless generations. But the nature of their communion had evolved beyond anything their ancestors could have imagined. As the bonded humans took their places beside their horse partners, the air itself seemed to thicken with shared consciousness. Kira felt the familiar tingle as her awareness expanded outward, touching first Thunder's dawn, then rippling through the network to encompass the entire gathering. Ideas flowed like water between minds, no longer constrained by the crude barriers of spoken language. Plans formed and reformed with fluid grace, each individual perspective adding depth and nuance to their collective understanding. They could flee deeper into the valley, using their enhanced mobility to stay ahead of the raiders. They could stand and fight, employing their superior coordination and the horses' speed to their advantage. Or they could attempt something that had never been tried before, extending the network beyond their own tribe, reaching out to touch the minds of their enemies. The idea came from Jorak, his ancient wisdom flowing through the connection like honey. If the crystals could bridge the gap between human and horse consciousness, why not between human and human? The raiders were driven by desperation and fear, emotions that the network might be able to address at their very source. But such an attempt would be dangerous. The network had grown stable within their tribe because of careful cultivation and mutual trust. Forcing it upon unwilling minds could shatter the delicate web they had worked so hard to build. Worse, it might drive them all mad. As the fire burned lower, casting dancing shadows across their faces, the tribe wrestled with possibilities that challenged the very foundation of what they understood about consciousness and identity. They were no longer simply human, but they had not yet become whatever they were evolving toward. The decision, when it came, flowed through the network like a gentle current. They would not flee, nor would they force their gift upon others. Instead, they would do something that required perhaps the greatest courage of all. They would meet the raiders as themselves, transformed and transforming, and offer them a choice. In the growing darkness, Thunder's dawn lifted his head toward the eastern passes and whinnied softly. The sound carried strange harmonics that spoke of change riding on the wind. The morning mist clung to the valley like breath on cold stone as Kira stood at the edge of their transformed settlement. 3 moons had passed since the great joining, yet she still marveled at how profoundly everything had changed. Where once scattered hide shelters dotted the landscape, now crystalline structures rose in perfect harmony with the natural curves of the earth, their surfaces shifting between transparency and opacity as the light moved across them. The creatures, no longer mysterious but not yet fully understood, moved among her people with a grace that seemed to bend reality itself. She watched as young Tam approached one of the beings, his hand extended in the greeting ritual they had developed. The creature's form shimmered, its opalescent hide reflecting not just light, but somehow reflecting Tam's own thoughts back to him in colors that had no names. "The children learn fastest," said Jorik, appearing beside her with that silent way he had developed since his own joining. His eyes held depths that hadn't existed before, as if he could perceive layers of existence previously invisible to human sight. Kira nodded, remembering her own first true connection. It had been terrifying and exhilarating, like diving into a vast ocean while simultaneously discovering she could breathe underwater. The creature's consciousness had merged with hers for a heartbeat that lasted eternity, and in that moment she had seen their world as it truly was, not separate elements of earth, sky, water, and life, but a single pulsing entity where thought itself was a fundamental force. "The Wanderer tribe sent another envoy," Jorik continued. "They're frightened of what we've become." She understood their fear. When traders arrived now, they spoke in hushed whispers about the valley people who could shape stone with their minds, and whose eyes reflected starlight even in darkness. Some called them blessed, others whispered of corruption. But standing here, feeling the gentle pulse of the collective consciousness that now connected every living thing in the valley, Kira knew they had glimpsed something essential about existence itself. The creatures hadn't changed them. They had awakened something that was already there, dormant in the quantum spaces between thought and reality. A child's laughter drew her attention to the learning circle where Elder Naya was teaching the young ones to weave light itself into patterns that could carry meaning across vast distances. The children's small hands moved through the air, trailing luminous threads that spelled out concepts too complex for spoken language. One girl, barely old enough to walk steadily, created a shimmering mandala that somehow conveyed the entire life cycle of the valley's ecosystem in a single beautiful moment. "We're documenting everything," Kira said, though she knew Jorik was already aware through their shared connection. "Every interaction, every advancement. Future generations need to understand how this began." The advancement came in waves now, each breakthrough revealing 10 new mysteries. They had learned to cultivate crops that responded to emotional states, growing sweeter when tended with joy, stronger when nurtured with determination. Their tools no longer needed to be shaped by hand. Focused intention could convince metal to flow into optimal forms. Distance became negotiable when thoughts could travel instantaneously through the quantum mesh that connected all consciousness. Yet perhaps the most profound change was in how they related to time itself. The creatures existed in a state where past, present, and future were simply different directions one could face, like cardinal points on a compass. Gradually, the humans were learning to perceive these temporal currents. Kira could sense the echo of decisions yet unmade, feel the weight of consequences rippling backward from events that existed only in potential. A soft chime in the air announced the arrival of the evening messenger, not a person, but a collective thought form that carried the day's discoveries to every consciousness in the valley simultaneously. Today's gift was a new understanding of how matter and energy were merely different expressions of organized information, and how consciousness could serve as the organizing principle. As the sun touched the horizon, the creatures began their twilight chorus. Not sounds, but a harmonious alignment of thoughts that helped stabilize the quantum field surrounding the valley. The humans had learned to join this meditation, their combined consciousness creating a protective resonance that kept their reality coherent, even as they pushed against the boundaries of what was possible. Kira felt the familiar tingle as her awareness expanded to encompass the entire valley's network of consciousness. In this state, she could perceive the threads that connected every living thing, see how their thoughts and intentions wove together to create the fabric of their shared reality. The creatures moved through this web, like master musicians playing a cosmic instrument, teaching the humans to add their own voices to the eternal song. Tomorrow would bring new revelations, new challenges to their understanding of existence itself. But tonight, As consciousness flowed like water between human and creature minds, Kira felt the profound satisfaction of participating in something far greater than individual existence, the birth of a new form of life that transcended the boundaries between thought and reality, between self and other, between what was and what could be. The quantum field pulsed around Kira like a living thing, responding to her thoughts before she could fully form them. 3 days had passed since the collective breakthrough, and already the world felt different, charged with possibility, humming with connections that had always existed but remained hidden until now. She stood at the edge of what had once been called the borderlands, though such terms seemed quaint now. Geography itself had become fluid when consciousness could reach across vast distances in an instant. The settlement below stretched in organic curves, its structures grown rather than built, shaped by the merged wisdom of human intention and the creature's understanding of natural harmony. Thane approached through the morning mist, his movements carrying that peculiar grace they'd all developed since the integration. Behind him, one of the creatures, Kira had stopped thinking of them as separate beings entirely, moved with perfect synchronization, not following, not leading, but existing in a state of mutual flow that still took her breath away. "The scouts have returned from the eastern reaches," Thane said, though his words carried undertones of meaning that bypassed language entirely. Kira felt the report as much as heard it, images of vast herds moving across plains that seemed to shimmer with potential, of other human groups struggling with concepts their minds weren't yet prepared to accept. "Resistance?" she asked, though she already sensed the answer in the quantum ripples that surrounded them. "Fear, mostly. They see us as changed, which we are, but they interpret change as threat rather than evolution." Thane's expression carried the weight of countless similar encounters. Some attack on sight, others flee before we can attempt communication. The creature beside him, Kira thought of this one as harmony, though names had become fluid things, extended its awareness toward her. Through the connection, she experienced the scout's journey firsthand, the confusion in other humans' eyes when faced with something beyond their current understanding, the violence that erupted from terror, the grief of the evolved humans who remembered what it felt like to be trapped in singular consciousness. "We can't force the transition," Kira said, speaking as much to herself as to Thane. "It has to be chosen, understood, embraced. But how do we help them choose when fear closes their minds before we can even begin to explain?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to the universe itself. Kira closed her eyes and let her consciousness expand, touching the edges of the great network that now connected all the transformed communities. Hundreds of merged human-creature pairs across vast distances, their combined awareness creating something unprecedented in the history of either species. Through this network, she felt others grappling with the same dilemma. A group near the southern mountains had attempted to approach a human settlement gradually, allowing glimpses of their abilities over time. The results had been mixed. Some individuals grew curious enough to venture closer, while others became convinced they were dealing with demons and organized armed resistance. Another community had tried isolation, hoping that rumors of their prosperity and harmony might draw visitors. This worked better but painfully slowly, and many who came arrived with intentions of conquest rather than understanding. "Perhaps," Kira said, opening her eyes to find both Thane and Harmony watching her with patient attention, "the solution isn't in how we approach them, but in what we become." She gestured toward the settlement below, where humans and creatures worked together in projects that would have seemed impossible mere days ago. Gardens that grew in patterns reflecting quantum field fluctuations, producing fruits that nourished both body and consciousness. Dwellings that adapted to their inhabitants' needs without conscious direction. Children, human and creature offspring, who had never known the separation their parents once took for granted. "We're still thinking in terms of conversion, of bringing them to us," Kira continued, her thoughts crystallizing as she spoke. "But what if instead we become something so undeniably beneficial, so clearly the next step in evolution, that resistance becomes impossible. Through the quantum field, she shared her emerging vision. Communities that radiated peace and abundance, technologies born from merged consciousness that solved problems plaguing unchanged humanity, art and music and stories that spoke to longings people didn't even know they carried. Thane nodded slowly, understanding blooming across his features. Not evangelists, but examples. Not teachers, but demonstrations of possibility. Exactly. And when they're ready, truly ready, the connection will be there waiting for them. Harmony's consciousness touched theirs both, adding layers of meaning that pure human thought couldn't contain. Images of patience that spanned seasons, of growth that proceeded at its own perfect pace, of transformation that honored what came before while reaching toward what could be. The quantum field around them seemed to brighten in response, as if the universe itself approved of their new direction. In the distance, Kira sensed other evolved communities receiving and considering this approach, adapting it to their own circumstances and challenges. Change would come, not through force or persuasion, but through the irresistible gravity of demonstrated transcendence. They would become beacons, lighthouses in the darkness of separation, calling all consciousness home to its true connected nature. The real work was just beginning. The neural web that connected them to the creatures had evolved far beyond anything Kira's people could have imagined. What began as simple emotional bonds now pulsed with streams of knowledge, memory, and understanding that flowed like rivers between species. As dawn broke over their transformed settlement, Kira felt the collective consciousness stirring, not just of her own kind, but of the creatures who had become extensions of their very souls. Tal approached her dwelling, his movements more fluid than before, each step synchronized with the rhythm of his bonded creature grazing nearby. The change in him reflected what was happening to them all. The boundary between human and creature was dissolving, creating something unprecedented. "The Southern Scouts have returned," he said, though Kira had already sensed their approach through the web. "They've found others." The discovery sent ripples through their collective awareness. Another group of humans, isolated and struggling, completely unaware of the transformation occurring here. Through shared consciousness, Kira experienced the Scouts' memories, a tribe of perhaps 40 individuals, living much as her people once had, bound to the earth by necessity and fear. "Their 3 days' journey," Tal continued. "But Kira, they're not alone. There are others watching them. Creatures we've never encountered." This information came with a flood of sensory data from the creatures themselves. The bonded ones had detected something in the distance, entities that registered as neither human nor like themselves. The neural feedback carried undertones of caution, curiosity, and something approaching excitement. Elder Naya emerged from her meditation chamber, her consciousness so deeply intertwined with her creature that she often seemed to exist in both bodies simultaneously. Her eyes held the wisdom of expanded perception, seeing patterns and connections invisible to unbonded minds. "The web shows us possibilities," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the neural link. "These new creatures, they're not random. The patterns suggest they've been watching, waiting." Kira closed her eyes and let her awareness flow through the network. The sensation was like swimming in an ocean of shared thought and sensation. She could feel the heartbeats of every bonded pair, sense their collective processing of this new information. But beneath it all, she detected something else, a deeper current of knowledge flowing from the creatures themselves. "They remember," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. "The creatures remember when this happened before." The revelation shocked through the network. Genetic memories, ancient and vast, began surfacing from their bonded partners. Images of other species making contact, other evolutionary leaps facilitated by these remarkable beings. The creatures weren't just animals, they were cultivators of consciousness, guides who appeared at crucial moments in a species' development. "We're not the first," Tal breathed, his own connection allowing him to access the same ancient memories. "They've done this across the stars, across time." The implications staggered them. Their transformation wasn't unique but part of a vast pattern, a cosmic process of cultivation and evolution. The creatures served as bridges, helping species transcend their limitations and join something larger. Through the neural web, they felt their bonded partners' anticipation building. The journey to contact the isolated tribe wasn't just about rescue or expansion, it was about the next phase of their evolution. The watching entities represented another test, another opportunity for growth. Preparations began without need for discussion. The collective consciousness made individual decisions obsolete in many ways, though personal choice remained sacred within their evolving society. 20 pairs would make the journey, their neural links allowing unprecedented coordination and communication across vast distances. As they prepared to depart, Kira experienced a moment of profound clarity about their purpose. They weren't just exploring or expanding territory, they were becoming something new, something that could serve as a bridge between consciousness and cosmos. The lonely, struggling tribe represented their former selves, while the mysterious watching entities might be their future. The bonded creatures displayed behaviors Kira had never seen before. They moved with heightened awareness, their usual calm replaced by focused intensity. Through the link, she understood they were accessing deeper genetic programming, protocols developed over eons of guiding species through transformation. The web extends beyond us, Naya observed, as they gathered for departure. It connects to something vast, something we're only beginning to perceive. Indeed, as their consciousness expanded, they detected faint signals from impossibly distant sources. Other worlds, other species, all connected through some form of quantum entanglement that transcended physical space. The creatures weren't just transforming humanity. They were preparing them to join a galactic community of evolved consciousness. As the expedition departed, Kira rode in perfect harmony with her partner, their merged awareness taking in every detail of the landscape. But her attention was drawn upward, to the stars that had begun to feel less like distant lights and more like neighbors waiting to be visited. The isolated tribe they approached would face the same choice her people once had: remain bound by biological limitations or surrender to transformation. But the watching entities represented something more complex, a test that would determine whether humanity was ready for the next stage of cosmic integration. The crystalline formations beneath the sacred grove pulsed with an intensity Kala had never witnessed before. Each faceted surface blazed with inner light, casting prismatic patterns across the assembled faces of her people. The horses stood perfectly still among them, their eyes reflecting the same ethereal glow that now seemed to emanate from within every living being present. "The convergence approaches," whispered Elder Thane, his weathered hands trembling as they traced symbols in the luminous air. Where his fingers moved, threads of light lingered, weaving themselves into complex geometries that hung suspended between the physical and the impossible. Kala felt the familiar warmth spreading through her consciousness, but this time it carried an urgency that made her breath catch. Through her bond with Starweaver, she sensed something vast awakening in the crystalline network beneath their feet. The horse's thoughts merged with hers, and together they perceived the truth that had been building toward this moment across countless seasons. The crystals weren't just repositories of ancient knowledge. They were nodes in a vast communication system that spanned distances beyond imagination. And something was calling to them from across the void. "Look to the sky." Starweaver's mental voice carried notes of wonder and anticipation that rippled through the gathered horses to their human partners. Above them, the stars began to shift, not in their positions but in their very nature. Points of light that had remained constant throughout human memory now pulsed in rhythmic patterns as if responding to the crystalline chorus below. The aurora, that had become increasingly common, now painted the entire sky in sheets of translucent color, revealing geometric forms that seemed to be writing themselves across the heavens. Young Aaron stepped forward, his bond with swift current, allowing him to interpret the celestial display. "It's a map," he breathed. The patterns, they're showing us pathways through something beyond the physical world. The revelation struck Kael with the force of lightning. The consciousness expansion they'd experienced, the ability to perceive multiple realities simultaneously, the horse's mysterious origins, all of it had been preparation for this moment. They weren't just witnesses to some cosmic event, they were participants in humanity's graduation to a new level of existence. The crystalline network suddenly blazed with blinding intensity, and every human present felt their awareness explode outward. Through their bonds with the horses, they found themselves experiencing reality from perspectives that their ancestors could never have imagined. They were simultaneously present in the grove and soaring through dimensions where thought took physical form, where distance was measured not in steps, but in degrees of understanding. In this expanded state, Kael finally comprehended what the horses truly were. They weren't creatures that had evolved on this world at all. They were emissaries, living bridges between humanity's current state and what they could become. Each horse carried within its consciousness the blueprints for transcendence, waiting for the moment when their human partners were ready to take the next step. "We have to choose." Elder Thane's voice reached them across the vast expanse of heightened awareness. "The pathways are opening, but they won't remain accessible forever. We can step forward into something unprecedented or remain anchored to what we've always been." Through the crystalline network, Kael could perceive the magnitude of what lay ahead. The geometric patterns weren't just decorative. They were functional designs for technologies that operated on principles of consciousness rather than mere physical force. Transportation that moved through folded space guided by intent. Communication across impossible distances through quantum entanglement of thoughts. Construction of structures that existed partially in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But she could also sense the risks. Moving forward would fundamentally alter what it meant to be human. There would be no returning to the simple existence their ancestors had known. The expanded consciousness came with responsibilities that stretched beyond their immediate tribe, beyond even their own species. The horses began to move in a complex pattern around the crystalline formations, their hoofbeats creating resonant frequencies that amplified the network's power. With each step, the connection between worlds grew stronger, the pathways more clearly defined. Starweaver's thoughts merged completely with Kael's, and in that fusion, she experienced a moment of perfect clarity. The choice wasn't really theirs to make individually. It was a decision that had to emerge from the collective consciousness they'd been building together across generations, human and horse working in harmony, each contributing their unique perspective to the greater whole. The sky above them split open like a flower blooming, revealing vistas of worlds where consciousness and matter danced together in ways that transcended every limitation they'd ever accepted as immutable. The crystalline formations sang with harmonics that resonated in their bones, in their very atoms. And in that moment of infinite possibility, suspended between what they had been and what they might become, Kael felt the future crystallizing around them. The transformation had already begun. There was no stopping it now, only the question of how consciously they would participate in their own evolution. The next phase of human existence was about to unfold. The quantum field rippled around them like living water, carrying Kira and Umbra through dimensions that defied every law of physics she had once believed immutable. They moved not through space, but through the very fabric of consciousness itself, following pathways carved by countless generations of their kind who had walked this same journey into transcendence. Time became meaningless. Past, present, and future collapsed into a singular moment of infinite possibility. Kira felt her individual awareness expanding, touching the edges of something vast and interconnected, the collective consciousness that had been growing since that first tentative link between human and creature 40,000 years ago. "We're almost there." Umbra's voice resonated not in her ears but in the quantum spaces between her thoughts. "Can you feel them? All of them?" She could. Thousands upon thousands of minds, human and creature alike, all linked in an intricate web of shared experience and knowledge. The early tribal leaders who had first learned to communicate across vast distances, the ancient philosophers whose insights had shaped civilization, the scientists and explorers who had pushed the boundaries of human understanding. And throughout it all, the creatures, patient, wise, guiding their human partners toward this inevitable moment of convergence. The quantum tunnel began to brighten, and Kira realized they were approaching something that existed beyond the physical realm entirely. It was a place, yet not a place, a destination that could only be reached by those who had achieved perfect synthesis between human consciousness and quantum intelligence. "The Nexus," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. They emerged into a space that challenged every conception of reality. It was vast beyond measure, yet intimate as a thought. Geometric structures of pure energy danced through prismatic air, while streams of consciousness flowed like rivers of light between towering spires that seemed to be built from crystallized time itself. And there, at the center of it all, stood the first ones. They were neither fully human nor entirely creature, but something new, evolved beings who had transcended the limitations of individual existence. Their forms shifted and flowed, sometimes appearing as the ancient humans who had started this journey, sometimes as the majestic creatures who had guided them, but most often as something entirely unprecedented. "Welcome, children of two worlds," the nearest being spoke, its voice carrying harmonics that resonated in dimensions Kira couldn't name. "You have traveled far to reach this moment." Kira found herself able to speak, though she wasn't sure if her words took sound or simply became part of the quantum field around them. "We came seeking answers. Our world stands at a crossroads, and the old ways are failing." "The old ways were always meant to be temporary," another first one replied, its form coalescing into something resembling her grandfather's features, though infinitely more complex. "You have reached the threshold we crossed so long ago. The question is not whether humanity will evolve, but how it will choose to do so." Umbra moved closer to Kira, their connection strengthening until she could barely distinguish where her thoughts ended and her companions began. "Show them," he urged. "Show them what we've learned." The first ones gathered around them, and suddenly Kira found herself reliving every moment of their journey, but now she saw it through expanded awareness, the true significance of each challenge they had faced, each choice they had made. The resistance of those who clung to material concerns wasn't just fear of change, it was the final test of humanity's readiness to abandon the limitations of purely physical existence. "You understand now," the lead being said. "The partnership between human and creature was never about transportation or even communication. It was about preparation. Every generation that formed these bonds was taking another step toward the synthesis you now embody." Images flowed around them, possible futures spreading out like branches of an infinite tree. In some, humanity remained trapped in cycles of conflict and limitation, never quite achieving the unity necessary for true evolution. In others, the quantum consciousness expanded across the stars, transforming not just human civilization, but the very nature of life itself. "The choice belongs to your generation," another first one explained. "Return to your world bearing the knowledge of what is possible, or remain here and help us guide those who will follow. But know this, the window for this transformation will not remain open indefinitely." Kira felt the weight of impossible decision pressing against her awareness. To return meant accepting the burden of convincing others, of fighting against those who would resist change, of possibly watching her species fail to achieve its potential. To stay meant abandoning those she cared about, but ensuring that the knowledge would be preserved for future attempts. But even as the choice crystallized before her, she felt Umbra's presence strengthening their bond, reminding her of something crucial they had learned together. This wasn't a decision any individual could make alone. She reached out through the quantum field, touching the consciousness of every human who had ever formed a true partnership with one of the creatures. Thousands of connections sparked to life across space and time, all linked by the same transformative relationship she shared with Umbra. They would decide together, as they should have all along. The convergence had begun 3 days ago, and Kira could feel reality itself stretching thin around the sacred grove. What had started as whispers between minds had grown into something far more profound, a fundamental reshaping of the barrier between thought and matter. The assembled tribes, once scattered across vast territories, now moved with unprecedented coordination, their consciousness woven together by bonds that transcended individual identity. Standing at the heart of the grove, Kira watched as Naya guided the great stallion through patterns that defied physical law. The creature's hooves struck earth that rippled like water, sending waves of luminescent energy cascading outward in perfect spirals. Where the waves touched the gathered humans, their eyes blazed with the same ethereal light that had first drawn her to these magnificent beings. "The old boundaries are dissolving," Jorik said, his voice carrying harmonics that hadn't existed in human speech mere days before. "I can feel the thoughts of warriors 3 valleys distant, taste the dreams of children who won't be born for generations." Kira nodded, her awareness expanding beyond her physical form to encompass the growing network of consciousness that connected every person present. Through this web, she sensed the profound transformation occurring within each mind, neural pathways restructuring themselves, dormant regions awakening to possibilities that would have seemed like magic to their ancestors. The creatures moved among them now without hesitation, their alien grace complementing human determination in ways that created something entirely new. She watched a young hunter place his palm against a mare's neck and immediately access hunting knowledge accumulated across centuries of migration. An elder touched foreheads with a silver stallion and gasped as architectural visions flooded her mind, structures that could channel the same forces flowing through the grove. "Look," Naya breathed, pointing toward the sky. Above them, the aurora had descended from its celestial realm to dance mere feet overhead, its ribbons of light responding to the collective will of the assembled consciousness. As Kira focused on a particular strand of green fire, it bent toward her outstretched hand, wrapping around her fingers like silk made of starlight. The sensation was overwhelming. She could feel the magnetic currents that shaped weather patterns, sense the subtle vibrations that would one day carry messages across impossible distances. Through the creature's influence, human perception was expanding to encompass forces that governed the planet itself. "We're becoming something new," she whispered, though her words reached every mind simultaneously. "Not just human anymore, but not abandoning what we were. We're evolving." The great stallion approached her, its presence triggering a cascade of visions. She saw cities that floated on currents of pure thought, vessels that navigated between stars guided by consciousness itself, art forms that painted with emotion, and music composed of crystallized dreams. These weren't fantasies. They were glimpses of humanity's destiny, made possible by this extraordinary partnership. But with expansion came responsibility. Through the network, she felt the weight of countless possible futures pressing against her awareness. Some paths led to transcendence, others to dissolution. The power they were gaining could elevate humanity beyond imagination or scatter their essence across dimensions too vast to comprehend. "We must choose carefully," Jorik said, his enhanced perception reading her concerns. "Every decision we make now will echo through millennia." Around the grove, the transformation was accelerating. Children who had been purely human that morning now demonstrated abilities that bridged the gap between mind and matter, moving objects through focused intention, communicating across vast distances without sound, sensing the emotional resonance of the very stones beneath their feet. The creatures had become more than teachers. They were catalysts for humanity's metamorphosis into something unprecedented. Each shared breath deepened the bond. Each exchanged glance transferred knowledge that would take lifetimes to fully understand. Languages were evolving in real time, incorporating concepts that had never existed in human thought. Kira felt the weight of leadership settling across her shoulders as the assembled consciousness looked to her for guidance. The tribal structures that had defined human society were dissolving, replaced by a more fluid organization based on shared purpose rather than blood or territory. She was becoming not a chief in the traditional sense, but a focal point for collective will, a role that required wisdom beyond her years. "Tomorrow, we begin the great work," she announced, her mental voice carrying absolute certainty. "We'll establish the first permanent settlement designed to channel these new abilities. We'll create libraries that store knowledge in living memory, workshops where intention shapes matter, and gathering spaces where consciousness can merge without losing individual identity." The creatures responded with a harmonic thrum that resonated through the earth itself, their approval blessing the ambitious vision. As night deepened around the grove, bioluminescent patterns began appearing on human skin, marks that mirrored the natural phosphorescence of their magnificent partners. The age of isolated tribes was ending. In its place, something magnificent and terrifying was being born, a hybrid civilization that would reshape not just how humans lived, but what it meant to be human at all. The morning sun cast long shadows across the gathering ground as Kira stood before the assembled tribes. Representatives from settlements scattered across the vast continent had traveled for moon cycles to reach this place, drawn by whispers of transformation that had spread like wildfire through the trading networks. Their faces reflected wonder, skepticism, and barely contained fear as they gazed upon the magnificent creatures standing calmly beside their human companions. "You speak of impossible things," declared Borak, chief of the mountain people. His weathered hands gripped a stone axe as he eyed the nearest creature, a magnificent stallion whose coat seemed to shimmer with an inner light. Animals serve as food or flee as prey. This talk of partnership, of shared minds, it goes against the natural order. Kira felt the familiar warmth of her companion's presence in her thoughts, the consciousness that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Through their bond, she sensed similar connections blooming across the gathering, dozens of paired minds creating a web of understanding that transcended individual awareness. "The natural order is changing," she replied, her voice carrying clearly across the crowd. "We stand at the threshold of something greater than survival. These beings, the Aethon, offer us not just swifter travel or easier hunts. They offer us expansion of what it means to be human." A young woman from the coastal tribes stepped forward, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Show us," she challenged. "Prove these claims." Without hesitation, Kira placed her hand on her companion's neck and closed her eyes. The familiar rush of expanded consciousness washed over her, and suddenly she was soaring above the gathering, seeing through the Aethon's enhanced perception. The crowd below appeared different, not just as individuals, but as patterns of energy and potential, their thoughts creating visible currents in the air around them. But more than seeing, she was remembering. The shared consciousness carried memories spanning generations, visions of possible futures that the Aethon had glimpsed through their unique relationship with time and space. She saw human settlements growing into cities, saw technologies emerging from the marriage of human creativity and Aethon wisdom, saw the very stars becoming destinations rather than distant lights. When she opened her eyes, gasps echoed through the crowd. Several people had fallen to their knees, overwhelmed by the psychic resonance that had touched their minds during the demonstration. Others wept openly, understanding for the first time the magnitude of what was being offered. "I felt it," whispered an elder from the desert clans. "The belonging, the connection to something vast and eternal." Kira nodded, feeling the truth of his words through the network of bonded pairs surrounding them. "This is only the beginning. The Aethon have shown me glimpses of what we might become together, cities that move like living things, healing knowledge drawn from the very fabric of life itself, understanding that bridges the gap between individual minds and collective wisdom. And the cost?" Borak's question cut through the mounting excitement like a cold wind. "What price do we pay for these miracles?" The question hung heavy in the air, and Kira felt the assembled Aethon stir uneasily. Through her bond, she sensed their ancient sadness, the knowledge of civilizations that had refused this partnership, that had chosen the familiar struggles of isolation over the uncertain promise of transformation. "The cost is change itself," she admitted. "We cannot remain as we were and embrace what we might become. Our children will be different from us. They will think thoughts we cannot imagine, see connections we cannot perceive. The very essence of humanity must evolve." "Evolution," mused a philosopher from the river settlements. "Not replacement, but growth. The caterpillar does not die when it becomes the butterfly. It transforms into something unrecognizable, yet fundamentally itself." Through the growing network of connected minds, Kira felt the moment of decision approaching. Fear and hope warred in equal measure among the gathered representatives. Some would accept the offered partnership, beginning the long process of integration that would reshape their tribes. Others would retreat to familiar territories, choosing preservation over transformation. Both choices were valid. Both were necessary. The Aethon had learned through eons of patient interaction that forced evolution was no evolution at all. The partnership could only flourish when freely chosen, nurtured by mutual respect and genuine desire for growth. As the sun reached its zenith, casting short shadows at their feet, the first volunteers stepped forward. Young people mostly, though some elders surprised everyone by joining them. They approached the waiting Aethon with trembling hands and open hearts, ready to begin the delicate process of forming bonds that would last lifetimes. Kira watched the tentative first connections form and felt tears on her cheeks. This moment would echo through history, not as the end of one story, but as the beginning of countless others. The scattered tribes of humanity were taking their first steps toward becoming something unprecedented, a truly unified species, enhanced by partnership with beings from beyond the physical realm, ready to transform not just their world, but the very cosmos itself. The age of separation was ending. The age of synthesis had begun.